All right, Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Welcome to the program. Of course, we're live on YouTube and subscribing platforms. And my guest this segment is Michael Betrus, best-selling author, researcher behind COVID-19 lockdowns on trial. Michael, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you.
Michael, I just had a guest on who told me that we are heading into a huge second wave of COVID that is going to be very devastating, and that he was very critical of President Trump, saying he's not taking it seriously, and he's claiming that the we've turned a curve, which is untrue. What is your data on that? Are we entering into another wave, and how serious is it if we are?
I think what we're seeing is a continuation of a first wave. So what you're seeing is a wave that almost went clockwise around the country. And so as it's hitting really predominantly Midwest states and some others, we're doing a lot of testing right now, over 1 million tests. And so if you look at our case counts, they are very high, but it's really a product of testing. So if you believe in random samplings, we might have 100 million people that have been infected with this. According to the CDC, or excuse me, the WHO estimate, when they came out about a month ago and said there might be 750 million people worldwide, that's a 17-fold increase. That would be in the US, 150 million people. If we test, we're going to get a lot of cases. Our deaths have actually been fairly flat across the board, really for months. Real-time deaths are in the 5 to 700 range out of 8,000 Americans that die every day. So I think that it needs to be contextualized. We're still running 5% of hospitalizations. 5% of all hospital beds are filled with COVID patients. We were down to 2. We were much, much higher in April. So I think it needs to be contextualized. I think the bigger question is, what would everybody have President Trump doing? Because they hailed Europe, a lot of the European leaders, and they hailed Spain and Italy back in the summer. Look what they're doing. Look how great it's going. And now it's not going so great. Same with UK. So I think that some of these defensible mitigation tactics that people think that are going to do anything against the virus, it just isn't proving to be the case.
So then, what should be done? I mean, we have a case right now with 3 states, my own state of Massachusetts, where the governor has just declared that there's going to be a curfew starting in this Friday. I'm surprised he didn't start it today, but we'll put that aside. Uh, we have Michigan, which of course has a new law saying that you have to take
Nope.
down everyone's name and number when they enter your business, or else you could be fined a lot of money and even go to jail. And then California, where the governor has released directives on how you are to conduct yourself at Thanksgiving dinner. Um, are these things sensible? I mean, it seems to me, I mean, from a political standpoint, that this is overreach, that this is it's a fiat grab for power, in my opinion. But what do I know?
Well, so let's break this apart. Let's take all 3. Let's start with California. Maybe the dumbest thing, the governor out of a sea of dumb things that's come out of California. Uh, how many people have a Thanksgiving room table that are a dining room table that would accommodate 6-foot distancing for all family members, as well as all the put your mask on in between bites? I mean, just insane, right? That really deviates from just family habits as it is. So that one's ridiculous. The Michigan one is a little more interesting. The Michigan one suggests that contact tracing actually matters. Contact tracing matters if you think back of the movie Outbreak, right? You had a very, very small contained environment, that small little town in California. And in that small an environment with identifiable spread, symptoms were very quick. Everybody was symptomatic. That's an environment where that type of thing makes sense. When you've got over 100 million people that have been infected with this, contact tracing and the resources to actually execute that are just completely ridiculous. So we can take the civil liberties argument. I don't take that argument in any of this stuff. I really look at just, from the data side, does it make sense? This one just doesn't make sense. Massachusetts is still actually fairly flat. And so there's not a lot of COVID activity going on. And I think the real question is, we're going to have to live with this virus. We live with other viruses. And in the words of Scott Atlas, the lockdowns are killing. And so The only mitigation thing that makes sense is you've got to protect and insulate the people that we know are vulnerable, the very elderly, the younger people that are severely obese, and a handful of other comorbidities. Nobody else is really at risk of this. The great thing about this is with a million deaths and tens of millions of cases around the world, we know, we really know who's at risk here. And so it's just ridiculous. Hopefully the election will, maybe have an impact on this. But it's crazy. And the thought that we're going to be in a lockdown mode on the 1 year anniversary of COVID, I just can't even believe where we are.
The CDC came out with a very interesting set of statistics, which are not being widely covered in the press, and that is that it's a little less than 1% of people who contract the disease under 80. The death rate is less than 1%. And then if you're 80 and up, it goes up to about 3 or 4%, which is actually pretty low. I mean, the likelihood of dying in a car accident is greater, I think, than COVID at this point. So I don't know if that is because of improved medicine or if the death rate actually has decreased. And I think that also it should be looked at in the context of how COVID is reported by hospitals, which is that if someone even has a tiny bit of COVID and they die, it's declared a COVID death when in fact it could have been a heart attack or cancer or some other disease. Um, and that the hospital actually gets a financial incentive to report it that way. In that context, it seems to me that the actual mortality rate for the disease has dropped. Is that the case, and why?
So you've got a couple things there. One, the only way to know the fatality rate is to really have a good estimation of what the infections are. But I actually just finished a couple days ago the second edition of Lockdowns on Trial. And based on samplings, the survival rate for COVID-19 is about 99.75%. So it's very high. That's not minimizing the 0.25%, but we've got 0.25% risk in lots of things that we do. So it's really a balance of the lockdowns themselves. Do the lockdowns actually mitigate this? And so when you look at samplings around the world, and actually, I get challenged on Twitter. Twitter has challenged me, Twitter users on South Dakota, and a guy who pretty sensible guy, but he's clearly pro lockdowns. And he said, well, Michael, at what number do you think that South Dakota is, should not be free and opened up? Because I applaud Kristi Noem's work. And I said, you need to look at it the other way around. It's not what is South Dakota's numbers. If you're locking down, you need to way outperform the areas that have not locked down. So when you look at neighboring places, just for that example, Minnesota and Idaho and North Dakota and Iowa is just an example. They need to way outperform South Dakota to validate that opening is a bad thing to do. And there's no statistical significance. When this thing comes in, it comes in. So that's the first thing. The fatality rate, we are seeing a few things. One, the treatments that happened in New York, and I'm not digging on anybody because in the moment there was a lot of hysteria and it was a lot of rush, and we've gotten better. But a lot of people died because of poor treatments in the hospitals. That's just a fact. No indictment, not blaming Cuomo, wasn't his fault, he wasn't even there. But that happened. So our treatments have gotten a lot better. So it is a lot less dangerous. And so what you really need to look at is contextualize our all-cause mortality. 350,000 more people have died this year than the average years, minus a little bit of 18 because that was big. And so I calculated about 170,000 real COVID-19 deaths this year. That's real. But I also calculated that we've got over 100,000 lockdown deaths. So what you really start to think about is you take your COVID deaths and then you subtract your lockdown deaths and you get this net number. And then you start to think, is that worth it all? We've got tens of millions of kids out of school right now. We've got cancer is not getting diagnosed properly. Vaccines aren't, right. The list is endless. The lockdowns are not worth it. And that's really it's about a balance.
Right. And of course, these governors are not considering what this is doing to the economy, what it's doing, as you say, to children, which I think suffer more than anybody because they're out of school, and situations like depression and suicide and alcoholism and drug abuse, divorce. I mean, it's just there are social consequences to this policy, and that has to be balanced with the science. I know that the Democratic candidate talks about listening to the scientists. Well, yeah, listen to them, but you have to synthesize that with politics and economy. I mean, there are a lot of factors that need to go into public policy decisions. They all need to sit down together, and each representing various interests, and craft public policy.
Yeah, so no doubt about it. Again, you've got a health risk on one side, and you've got lockdown consequences on the other, and they're all the things you mentioned: social collapse, domestic violence, kids out of school, child abuse. That's all real. Suicides, overdose, deaths of despair. That's real. Medical things that aren't getting treated. That's real. Kids being out of school is huge, right? That's real.
Yes, it is.
And then you've got how many deaths are we saving? And so when we look at these, you look at Florida. Florida is basically flat since they opened up about 5 weeks ago. If and what that's showing, I really thought, I was so optimistic. I was so excited when DeSantis did this, because I thought that would demonstrate as a control group that lockdowns really aren't. They don't really perform a lot better than not locking down. And again, I feel like after the election, regardless of the outcome, hopefully things will relax. I don't know. What I'm very curious about, I see your Trump 2020 microphone there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very curious, not just about about the presidential side, but a lot of the House seats that are up, that are aligned with strict lockdowns. We had two that flipped in June, I think, or whenever those special. There was one in California and Katie Hill seat, and one in Wisconsin. Those both flipped. Those were hard lockdown areas. I'm very curious to look tomorrow or the next.
No, it should be quite interesting to see, and I think that the lockdowns, the people that take a more extreme position, they're going to be hurt by because they'll be out, and I think that it's going to lead to a lot of people voting for Trump, not because they like Trump, but because they're opposing their governors who are involved in this extreme program.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question, Charles.
No, I'm just commenting on your comment here that yeah, I think that you bring up the fact that, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. We'll know later today, hopefully, but that people are going to vote for Trump, not because they like Trump necessarily, but because they're protesting against their governors. And they don't
Right.
want to
So
see it's destroying their businesses, it's destroying their families.
yeah, so I actually wrote in the first version, the first edition of this book. I wrote almost all of it in April, and I called then that the election today would end up being more a referendum on the lockdowns than it would President Trump. That's what I thought then, because I
Yeah,
thought
and
this
I
was
think
so
that's
severe.
that's very observant of you. I actually just wrote a column thinking that same way, and I think that it's absolutely going to backfire on them. The lockdown policy, which is we're way beyond that already. I mean, we had the 2 week lockdown. I just don't see. I mean, and I don't think it's going to continue if Trump wins, because I do think there's a political element to it.
So there's a political element, Charles, but think about this. You've got polls that are on both sides. You've got a Gallup poll that came out 3 weeks ago. Well, it was done at the end of September. Only 3% of Democrats wanted the country to get back to normal. Only 54% of Republicans wanted it. So if you weight that, 2/3 of the country doesn't. The reason is there's so much fear that's propagated and lack of context and lack of the collateral consequences of lockdowns that are in the media. People really are afraid. And so the politicians have got a green light to do this because they're not really getting protested or challenged. And the reason is, I think it's genuine. People really are probably not just in fear, but over fearing the risk of the virus compared to all this collateral damage. So I don't know that tomorrow is going to be a trigger point. I actually am feeling like this. We're going to hit a 1-year anniversary on this, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose. I mean, but people have maybe even gotten used to it. I mean, it's I can't imagine it, but yet, yeah, I mean, it's troubling to think that would be the case. Now, how have things worked out in Sweden?
So Sweden's very interesting. Sweden really didn't lock down. They're completely open today. No masks, no restrictions. They're seeing a rise in cases now, like all of Europe is. Their deaths are still very low, very flat. Again, you have to contextualize this with all cause.
Mhm.
But there's no data. Again, what I look at is it's not like Sweden doesn't have to prove that not locking down is great. The other countries and cities have to prove that locking down significantly improves the situation. And it's really just the opposite in Sweden. So you probably have some degree of a population immunity situation in Sweden. But at the end of it, there's a little bit of does it even matter? Sweden's right in the mix on overall deaths per million in Europe and with the US. And if you're locking down, you need to do way better than that. And all the Western European countries really aren't doing, they're all kind of in the mix. And so is the US. So Sweden's, to me, the best point of Sweden isn't that they didn't lock down and they had no deaths. It's that they didn't get beat and they didn't have the collateral damage. And that's an important sort of context that nobody really talks about.
That is really interesting. In other words, Sweden is no better or worse than countries that did the full lockdown, except in the biggest sense, they're better off because they didn't do the lockdown.
Well, way better off because their unemployment's
Yeah.
better, their economy's doing better, their kids are in school. And so I go back to South Dakota. People are hammering, certain people are hammering Kristi Noem,
Yeah.
right, for not locking down. South Dakota needs to be far outperformed by neighboring states that have kids out of school in order for Kristi Noem to be held sort of, if not responsible, sort of as let's just say bad judgment. That's not the case here. They're all statistically about the same. Florida, if you want to complain about Florida being opened up, Florida needs to be doing far worse than neighboring states or similar demographic type states that are, and that isn't the case.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is a very basic fact that should be looked at. It's really, we're going to get the thing and we should take personal precautions, of course. Wash your hands. Don't go into a enclosed area without the mask. I don't. I mean, these are normal things to do and to avoid crowds. But this whole lockdown thing, it really hasn't made a difference either way. And there doesn't need to be so much government involvement. People can exercise good common sense. I mean, if you're vulnerable to it because you're 80 years old or older, or you have a pre-existing condition, then fine, lock down. But a lot of this sort of tension and fear, I mean, I hate to think that it is, but I do think that it's political. I think they're trying to drive people away from voting with this.
So I didn't take that angle because, and I haven't really thought specifically about voting simply because this has been going on for so long, and it's going on in other countries. This insanity
Right.
is going on. UK is getting ready to lock down, and the person that does the layout for my book, she actually lives in Leeds, England, and she
Hmm.
sent me an email over the weekend. I said, how's it going? You guys got another lockdown Saturday? She said we were all behind it, supportive the first time. Now there's a lot of disunity. It's very fragmented. There's a lot of dissension. People aren't embracing this one. It's kind of like, when is this going to stop? And, what we should really be doing is something more akin to, I've got 89-year-old parents in Detroit. Detroit was hard hit. Michigan's been pretty good the last few months, but we haven't really had my parents get out of their house in Detroit for hardly, for really months, or leave their property, let's say. And I've got a 20-year-old, I live in Dallas. I've got a 20-year-old son at a Big 12 school. I told him to live his life as normal as possible. I do too. And that's really the best practice that everybody should follow until we get through it. And get through it really means the only through it is some combination of a population immunity and a vaccine. They really serve the same function. What you end up getting is enough people that are immune to it that there's not enough people to transmit it to make it rampant like it's been.
Now, are you hopeful about the creation of a vaccine that's safe and that's conventional, but that it's not going to be too dangerous?
I will tell you that I feel like that's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. And so I feel like we will probably be at a population immunity status, or that's probably where we end up as a way to get this through the decline quicker than the vaccine. The things
Hmm.
that I've read might speculate that we get a 50% effectiveness with a vaccine. I don't know what that's going to be. It's a coronavirus. Most of our colds and flus are coronaviruses. So we have, it's not SARS-CoV-2, but it's something like that. And so we get a 50% hit rate on those each year with our seasonal flus. This should be a fixed virus. It should probably over a couple evolutions be easier. I don't know how that plays out. I think the population immunity thing probably works its way through quicker.
Oh, okay, well that's encouraging. Now, just as a little side thought here, there was a lot of concern at the very beginning of the pandemic that it was going to really hit Africa very heavily because you get a lot of poverty, you got people living in close quarters, and yet it's barely touched Africa. Um, I've heard it. The reason is because Africa is a younger continent. You don't have too many people who are 80 years old and up. And I think that generally it's been over half of the numbers of people who have passed away from this disease are over 80. Is that what's going on there? And why are they having so many less cases?
Well, the big picture answer is I want to say I'm not super familiar with Africa, but here's a comment similar to that I make is a better example because we don't have great information about Africa. We do about Japan and South Korea.
Uh-huh.
And those are areas that have had fairly decent cases, very, very low coronavirus deaths. And so the speculation is you've got very low obesity in those countries. You do have an old population in Japan, for example, but you've got a healthy population. They're not obese, and they might have some kind of uh, immunity to coronaviruses over time that might be variant, in which case they get less affected. But Africa is not alone there. What you've really got is, Japan and South Korea. Japan's a huge country in population, densely populated,
Mm-hmm.
elderly, a lot of smokers, and they really have been unscathed through this. And they didn't really lock down either, by the way.
And this is because they're just healthier. They have healthier habits. They're not obese.
I've read medical art analysis on this in the Lancet and MedRx, and I can tell you they don't really know. The conclusions drawn were speculative, and they were what I mentioned, which is low obesity, healthy population, possible immunity to coronaviruses from being in the Far East, and beyond that, nobody's really sure.
Well, because I know that South Korea, at least, I don't know about Japan, but they did a very, very strict lockdown. I'm pretty sure.
Well, yeah, a little more surgical. They did a lot of contact tracing early, but if you look at South Korea, over the summer and later, the virus did what the virus does. They ended up having a fairly decent spike, as well as Japan in cases, but deaths very low, very, very low. I want to say that they're under 20 deaths per million or something, whereas the US, might be 700 or something, but it's very, very, the results have been very good in those two countries, and no one's exactly sure why.
They don't take hydroxychloroquine over the counter.
I I'm not actually sure what the status is of any of their
Oh.
medications over there.
All right. So, Michael Betrus, by the way, what do you think is going to happen today with the election?
um, I've been calling it for a while, but I do think President Trump's going to win. I thought the economy and a lot of things were going well in spite of a lot of people not caring for his personality. If you vote on policies, you've got really good results economically for minorities as well as pretty much everybody going back to January or February. I don't think the lockdowns have helped the Democrat message. Buttigieg said the other day, a couple days ago, if Biden gets in, national lockdowns could be on the table.
Mm.
That really wouldn't be necessarily constitutional, but that's not really the point. That's the messaging. That's a green light, more lockdowns. And again, for all the reasons we talked about on the front end of this, it doesn't make any sense. So I do think that I do think President Trump's going to come out on top. I think that the Republicans are going to hold the Senate. And I'm very anxious to see specifically if House seats flip in the tight lockdown cities or states. What do you think?
Well, I
Charles, what do
think
you think?
I kind of am. I mean, I'm optimistic in that way. I think so. I mean, I heard some very troubling news just before going on with you that that the media is preparing to declare Biden the winner, and he's going to then immediately start to set up government. It's almost like a coup d'état. I don't know. I mean, it's troubling. I mean, who knows? And there's some instances of voter fraud out there. I don't trust the other side to fly right. I mean, He's going to have to
Well,
do convincingly well and convincingly well early.
well, you've got two things though. One, you've got the media, which you know, I, we could talk for a couple hours on the media coverage of both the election and the COVID-19 situation. But if you think back a year ago, it was Obama who called Hillary and said, you need to concede this, you need to cut it. I don't believe that Biden, as long as he's been around the block, is going to declare unless he knows it. I don't believe that.
Okay,
So the media might declare it, but I don't see Joe Biden getting up there making a claim to victory without having it in the bag. I'll be surprised about that.
I hope not. I mean, you never know, but I hope not. I mean, I do think that if nature takes its course, Trump is going to win, and he's going to increase his margins in all 50 states. He may even pick off a few other states he didn't have before. I would particularly look at Minnesota, Nevada, a couple of other states. And I
Yeah,
think that the Senate the Republicans will hold on to the Senate. They may even lose a seat or two, but they'll hold on, and they'll increase their margin in the House. I don't know if they'll take the House, but the Democrats only hold it by a thread. I mean, I think 17 congressmen. I think that
right.
the Republicans could squeeze them a little bit there.
Could be. Could
Who
be.
knows?
It'll be anxious to see, and I'll be glued to the TV just like you will tonight.
Okay, so let my listeners and viewers know where they can get your book, Michael.
It's only on Amazon. It's the only way to get it up that fast. So it's on Amazon.com, and it's COVID-19 lockdowns on trial. And I appreciate you having this discussion, Charles.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Michael Betrus. As always, thank you.
Thank you.